The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, recently published 4 landmark regional assessment reports, one each for the Americas, Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and Asia and the Pacific. The result of 3 years of work by more than 550 leading experts from over 100 countries, the 4 IPBES reports are the most important expert contribution of the past decade to the state of knowledge about biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. The reports focus on answers to key questions about the importance of biodiversity, progress being made to conserve it, and the threats and opportunities for a sustainable future. With the best available information communicated effectively, people all over the world can make better decisions and take more effective action to meet global commitments such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi Biodiversity Targets, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Across Europe and Central Asia, nature contributes to economies and human health through the provision of food, medicine, and improved mental and physical well-being. There is, however, a continuing decline in biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. Wetlands have declined by 50% since 1970, with significant degradation of grasslands, peatlands, and coastal marine habitats as well. The IPBES report reveals that the region's ecosystems face several challenges with regards to species diversity, with 28% of assessed species unique to the region currently classified as threatened. The status of biodiversity across the region has been declining in 14 out of 15 land-based habitat types since the 1950s and continues to do so. While in the European Union, 27% of marine species and 66% of marine habitat types show an unfavorable conservation status. Intensifying agriculture and forestry, combined with natural resource extraction, urban development, pollution, invasive alien species, and climate change have also led to a decline in biodiversity and an increasing loss of indigenous and local knowledge. There has been some progress in increasing protected areas and mainstreaming biodiversity across governments and societies. However, current trends are unfavorable for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi targets, and climate commitments in the region. The IPBES report highlights the better use of policy and integrated approaches to motivate changes in behavior, as well as capacity building for indigenous peoples and local communities, and sufficient funding to support research, monitoring, education, and training. The message from all 4 IPBES regional assessment reports is that, with the exception of some positive examples, biodiversity and nature's capacity to contribute to people are being degraded, reduced, and lost due to a number of common pressures, including habitat stress, the overexploitation and unsustainable use of natural resources, air, land, and water pollution, increasing numbers and impacts of invasive alien species, as well as climate change, among others.
The best available evidence, gathered by the world's leading experts, points us now to a single conclusion. We must act to halt and reverse the unsustainable use of nature, or risk not only the future we want, but even the lives we currently lead. Fortunately, the evidence also shows that we know how to protect and partially restore our vital natural assets.
IPBES, Science and Policy for People and Nature.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session of the IPBES webinar series. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the short video teasing the findings of the Europe and Central Asia assessment, and that you're looking forward to going more in-depth into the assessment findings with Marcus Fisher and Mark Rounswell, the 2 assessment co-chairs. Before giving the floor to Mark and Marcus, I'd like to remind you that the recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, will be made available on the IPBES website. On the IPBES website, you can also access a range of other resources, including recordings of all previous webinars, the full report and summary for policymakers for the Europe and Central Asia assessment, as well as any other completed assessment, and e-learning tools. If you have any questions about the webinar series, or any other aspects of IPBES work on capacity building, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on email, tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. And with that, let me hand over to our presenters for today. We're very happy to have both of you join us today, Mark and Marcus, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Arkon. Welcome, everybody. The assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services in Europe and Central Asia was elaborated by a group of more than 120 experts, which had been selected from nominations from many countries, and they represented 36 of the 54 countries in the region. The expert group screened more than 4,000 publications, which were scientific papers, but also various reports, and very importantly, also indigenous and local knowledge sources. During the process, the report underwent 2 cycles of reviews and drew more than 7,000 comments from external reviewers, expert reviewers, and from governments, which helped very much to refine the report. The geographic scope of the assessment was Europe and Central Asia, and Europe is a very broad definition, as you can see here, where Eastern Europe included all of Russia, that is also the Asian part of Russia, all the way to the Pacific. And the assessment took place for the whole region, but also for 4 sub-regions, Western, Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as depicted here, as well as the seas under national jurisdiction by the countries in this region. The units of analysis for terrestrial biodiversity were, as you can see here, various natural systems. In the upper panel, you can see several belts from the Arctic to the Mediterranean and southern levels. And there were also several anthropogenic types of ecosystems, urban ecosystems, for example, agro-ecosystems, and so forth. Very importantly, ecosystem services were considered through the lens of the so-called nature's contributions to people, which embody the scientific concept of ecosystem services and goods, but also the notion of nature's gifts, which is more familiar amongst indigenous and local knowledge systems. As depicted here, nature's contributions to people were classified according to 3 categories: regulating, material, and non-material contributions. And it's important to note that the individual categories within these contributions do not necessarily only belong to one of these categories. For example, food is a material contribution of nature to people, but at the same time, it also provides non-material services, for example, social, or is of social and cultural value, and similar for the other services or contributions mentioned here. You can see that there is for categories of material services, 8 categories of regulating services, and 4 of non-material services, and they have all been assessed from the available literature and indigenous and local knowledge. And they were also assessed in their relation to quality of life. So what is the value of these contributions for various components of quality of life, as you can see depicted here, which moved from instrumental to more relational, so from material security versus health to cultural heritage, identity issues, and justice and equity. So the idea was to be very, very inclusive in the contributions of nature to people and to consider various worldviews. The policy relevant questions to be addressed by the assessment were outlined in the scoping document, which was derived from a scoping process commissioned by the plenary of IPBES, and then the scoping report was accepted by the plenary of IPBES, and the expert team commissioned to respond to these policy relevant questions, 5 of them actually. The first one was how biodiversity and ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people, contribute to the economy, to livelihoods, food security and well-being. The second question was, what are the status and trends and potential future dynamics in biodiversity and ecosystem services, or nature's contributions? What are the drivers of change, and also what are the trends in these drivers? What are the impacts of various policies and interventions by governance or by other institutions? And finally, what are important knowledge gaps? These questions map very nicely onto the conceptual framework of IPBES, which you can see here. And starting in the upper left corner of the diagram, we see the first question, the importance of nature for humans, the relevance of nature's contributions to people for quality of life. Then we see the second question, trends in nature or trends in biodiversity and how they affect ecosystem services or nature's contributions. Then here's the third question, how do the direct drivers, land use change, climate change and so forth affect biodiversity? Then the fourth question are concerning opportunities for interventions and policy, which is situated here in the center. And finally, the question for the knowledge gaps. And this framework and the questions are reflected in the structure both of the assessment report and in the summary for policymakers. Here we see the sections of the summary for policymakers, starting with the status of and trends in nature's contributions to people and their attribution to biodiversity changes, then moving on to status and trends in biodiversity and the attribution of these changes to direct drivers of change, then the status and trends in direct drivers and their attribution to the indirect societal drivers, then the section on scenarios and pathways, where could the region go, what would be desirable futures and what are plausible futures, and finally the sections, what are the options for decisions to move the region in the direction of desirable futures. And when I'm saying desirable, I want to emphasize that nothing is the opinion of the expert team elaborating the report, but that is reviewing the evidence that was there. This structure of the summary for policymakers also reflects the structure of the report, where this section was subject of section A was subject of chapter 2, and then chapter 3, 4, 5, 6 of the assessment report reflect exactly the sections of the summary for policymakers as shown here. Now, if we go into the findings of the assessment, we start with nature's contributions to people. They were found extremely precious all over Europe and Central Asia, and that they were essential for human life, for quality of life. And saying that, I mean that the nature's contributions to people, all these 18 categories were valuable, and they contributed to the various components of quality of life that I had shown earlier. This also includes economic value, which can amount to thousands of dollars per hectare and year, but it is certainly not limited to economic value, because the assessment also concerned various other values, including cultural values and social values based on indigenous and local knowledge, and these were also very considerable. Another important finding was that non-material and regulating contributions were at least as valuable in several respects as the material contributions such as food and timber production. Also, a very important finding was that material contributions, and especially food productions, have been consumed at the expense of regulating and non-material contributions. And to illustrate these findings, first on the economic values, here are a few examples. Estimates of the value in terms of dollars and per hectare and year for regulation of climate, habitat creation and maintenance, and regulation of freshwater and coastal water quality. We see that is in the hundreds or thousands of dollars per hectare and year, just a few estimates. And as mentioned, very importantly, unfortunately, most of the regulating contributions of nature to people were actually declining during the last 50 years. That is also depicted in this diagram that you can see here for the various categories of nature's contributions to people, which you can see in the left, first the regulating, then the material, then the non-material ones. You can see many downward arrows with a red background for the subregions of Europe and Central Asia, to the left Western Europe, then Central Europe, then Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and to the right the region as a whole. And you notice that the only service with arrows pointing upwards and the green background is actually food production. That is the only service that has increased over the last decades, and that came at the expense of declining other contributions. Many of the regulating ones you can see down the arrows and red backgrounds, and also non-material ones. The declines in nature's contributions to people have been caused by declines in biodiversity, which is underpinning these contributions. And here are a few examples concerning the units of analysis, the different subbiomes that we had assessed. The extent of wetlands, for example, in Western, Central and Eastern Europe has declined by 50% since 1970. The biodiversity status of 14 out of 15 terrestrial habitat types across the region has been declining since the 1950s. And only 9% of the marine habitat types in EU assessments of species and habitat types of conservation interest showed a favorable conservation status. So these are very, very sobering numbers actually. And if we move on to the status and trends for species, we notice that 26% of the known marine fish populations are in decline, whereas only less than 2% are actually increasing. 42% of the assessed terrestrial animal and plant species are declining, and 71% of freshwater fish and 60% of amphibians with known population trends have been declining. So this is also very severe declines in biodiversity. And the situation is summarized here in trends in the biodiversity status for the different units of analysis that were assessed. To the left, you can see several categories of terrestrial units of analysis, like subbiomes. Then you can see in the lower half of the diagram, you can see freshwater and other inland surface waters. And at the bottom, you can see the marine systems. And for all these systems, we assessed past trends and present trends by subregion and for the region as a whole. And as you can see from the many, many downward arrows and with the red background, we can see there is a decline all over the region, all over the different units of analysis. So there's a very severe decline in biodiversity. And now I hand over the word to Mark Rounsewell, the other co-chair of the assessment, to tell us about the causes of these declines. Please, Mark.
Thank you, Marcus. So as Marcus has highlighted, we clearly have a number of problems within the Europe and Central Asia region with respect to declines in biodiversity and with respect to the implications of that for nature's contributions to people. So the key questions now are, what are the underlying causes of those declines in the natural world? And if we understand what those causes actually are, what can we do about it? What can we do to try to find solutions to these problems? And that's what I'm going to present at this moment now, thinking about the causes of these problems and thinking about the solutions that we can implement in practice. So the first thing to say is that the direct causes of declines in biodiversity can be attributed to human activities. We found the most important cause of declines in biodiversity being due to land use change, particularly due to the intensification of land use activities in, for example, agriculture and forestry systems. We also found, however, that climate change has had a discernible impact on the decline of biodiversity, and we expect that the effect of climate change will become more important going forward into the future. However, there are a number of other direct drivers or underlying causes of changes in biodiversity: natural resource extraction, pollution, particularly, for example, of pollinator species, and the role of invasive alien species have all had significant impacts on the decline of biodiversity. And this figure shows the various trends in these direct drivers. So we have the 5 direct drivers along the top: land use, climate change, invasive species, pollution and extraction. And on the left-hand side, we have the units of analysis that Marcus introduced earlier. The different columns represent the different sub-regions of the ECHA region, so Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And what you can see from this table is it's almost exclusively red in colour, and the arrows are almost exclusively increasing. That means that the effects of these direct drivers is increasing across all of the sub-regions and across almost all of the units of analysis, the different ecosystem types. There are very few exceptions to those trends everywhere. But we also need to understand what are the underlying causes of the changes in these direct drivers. And again, these reflect the indirect drivers, activities that reflect, for example, societal choices about consumption preferences, the indirect drivers arising from government policy and intervention. We have the role of economic growth. Clearly, population growth and how that affects consumption is incredibly important. And technological development also plays a role in the ways in which those direct drivers are manifest in declines in biodiversity. Some of the effects have also been associated with losses of indigenous and local knowledge, since many of these practices are associated with being biodiversity friendly. We also found that the region as a whole consumes much more natural resource than it produces. That means that the ECHA region has a very large ecological footprint on the rest of the world. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. But if we look first of all at the role of indirect drivers in affecting the direct drivers, these two tables show at the top land use change as a direct driver, and on the bottom table climate change, pollution, resource extraction and alien species. And on the left-hand side, the first column, you'll see the various types of indirect drivers: institutional, economic, demographic, cultural and technological. Again, what you can see is that there are many more crosses and red cells within this tabulation than there are positive or ticks. And there are a number of cells where we have directions which are happening in both ways. We're finding especially that the economic development as an indirect driver has a major impact, as does changes in demography. There are some positive messages, however. So in a number of cases, particularly looking at climate change, pollution, institutional indirect drivers are having positive effects. And technology can also play a positive role if appropriately used and implemented. So in terms of the ecological footprint, this is clearly demonstrated by the table on the top right-hand side of this slide. If you look, for example, at Western Europe as one region, it has an ecological footprint of 5.1 hectares per person per capita per year. But Western Europe only produces about 2.2 hectares per person per year of biocapacity of natural resources. So it means that we're consuming more than twice as much as we're actually producing in Western Europe. And that consumption has to come from other parts of the world. So we import our consumption from elsewhere, or put it another way, we displace our environmental impact to other parts of the world. And as you can see, for most of the sub-regions for the eco-region as a whole, similar types of figures can be seen. So the problem we have is somewhat of a conundrum, because we know that in Europe and Central Asia, we know that land use and land use intensification is a major impact on biodiversity. So it would seem evident that we would simply de-intensify, for example, food production, and that would reduce the impacts on biodiversity within the eco-region. However, the problem of doing that is if we reduce our food production and the intensification of that production, then we're likely to need to increase imports from the rest of the world. And that simply means that we displace our ecological footprint elsewhere. So what we can't avoid considering as a consequence here is not only to focus on the production side of natural resources, but also to focus very, very carefully on how we consume nature's contributions to people. So ultimately, we need to make a step change in the way we consume natural resources, both within the eco-region and in the rest of the world. So one of the important frameworks we've looked at to explore the ways in which these trends are playing out is through the Aichi biodiversity targets. There are a number of targets within that, far too many to go through in detail, but we can look at the level of the individual goals, the strategic goals, to see what we're achieving with respect to the Aichi biodiversity targets. And there has been some progress in addressing the underlying causes of biodiversity loss through mainstreaming of biodiversity across government and society. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. However, it's still very clear that there are still a number of subsidy mechanisms that are perverse subsidies that have negative impacts on biodiversity. And there needs to be further reform across some of these negative impacts through subsidies. We're also observing that the pressure on direct drivers on biodiversity is unlikely to be reduced, as I showed in the tables earlier, and it means that many of the Aichi biodiversity targets around reducing pressures of direct drivers are unlikely to be met. There has, however, been some progress in safeguarding ecosystem species and genetic diversity through protected areas. And in many cases, the Aichi biodiversity target of 17% of the terrestrial surface has been met in most of the eco-region. Indeed, within the European Union, the figure is more like 25% of the terrestrial surface. So we have made some progress in protected areas. However, we have not advanced the benefits of biodiversity ecosystem services to everybody due to the continued deterioration of nature's contributions to people, and also because of the unequal distribution of these contributions to different parts of society. Again, there's been some implementation of participatory planning and knowledge management for capacity building has been positive in many cases, but we still find that there has been a significant erosion of indigenous and local knowledge. So on the whole, many of the administrative type Aichi biodiversity targets have been achieved. We've signed protocols, we've managed to increase protected areas, but we still haven't addressed the Aichi biodiversity targets that look at the underlying pressures and the loss of biodiversity. So most of what we've been talking about so far has concerned past and present trends in biodiversity and nature's contributions and the underlying drivers of those. But within the assessment, we also explore the literature that is looking at the future of biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. First of all, we looked at trying to construct a range of what we term scenario archetypes. These are ways of classifying the literature of a wide range of different scenario types into some generic categorizations. So in this table, you'll see the scenario archetypes that we use: business as usual, economic optimism, regional competition, regional sustainability, global sustainable development, and inequality scenario archetypes. And each of those archetypes have a different way of representing the different direct and indirect drivers through their storylines and through the quantification of their impacts. Again, this table tries to demonstrate how those drivers are either increasing or decreasing, which are effectively the underlying assumptions within those different scenarios. And we can then explore how those different scenario archetypes would have effects on biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. And that's what this table is trying to show. What you can see, first of all, is if you look at the scenario archetypes across the top, if you look at the business as usual archetype, you can see that all of the arrows here, basically most of the arrows are pointing downwards, and that we have a lot of red cells. So basically, business as usual is not an option. If we continue through the management and actions of our current activities into the future, we will continue to see declines in biodiversity and the erosion of the contributions of nature to people. So business as usual is not an option. If we look at some of the scenarios that are focused on economic growth, economic optimism, they also tend to have very negative outcomes, again shown by many of the downward arrows. They have some benefits in some resources, but not always. Some other scenario archetypes, regional sustainability, global sustainable development, for example, have more benefits. There are more green cells, more upward arrows. But we found as well that there's not a single scenario archetype that doesn't have some form of trade-offs across the different contributions of nature to people. There isn't a panacea in the future for all the problems we're observing today. There are, however, some things that we can do to address some of these problems. It became clear that decoupling of economic growth from the degradation of nature is extremely important. So we need to remove perverse subsidies. We need to internalize the true costs of environmental degradation into the prices of the goods that we pay for in shops. For example, our food consumption. But also we need to look at ways of measuring national welfare beyond the traditional and current economic indicators such as GDP. We need to explore other ways of embedding welfare within those different issues. So in addition to the scenario literature, we also explored pathways of actions that could be used to achieve visions of a beneficial future for biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. And again, we used a categorization form of archetypes of 4 different types of pathways: transition movements, green economy, low carbon economy, ecotopian pathways as well. And what we try to explore is, within the context of different scenario archetypes, how would these different pathways and their descriptions of how we could move through actions and management into the future would play out. We used as a reference framework for that the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can see, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG wheel of the different SDGs here, we try to explore the magnitude of the effect of different assumptions about different pathways and their contribution towards the SDGs. And again, what we find is that different pathways have very, very different impacts on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, the most effective pathways were those that stressed long-term societal transformation rather than the pathways that focused on a continuation of the economic paradigm that we're locked into in the present day. So having looked at all of these issues and a range of different pathways and scenarios of how we might be able to move forward into the future, we also explored future options for the region as a whole, for the ecoregion. So what can we actually do through policy and through the management and conservation of biodiversity to do things better in the future than we've done in the past? So the first thing we explored was the importance of mainstreaming biodiversity concerns. And by mainstreaming, we mean here three steps in the mainstreaming process. It's about raising awareness across society about some of these problems and what we can do about it. It's about defining precise policy objectives that also incorporate concerns about biodiversity loss. And it's about designing policy instruments and coming up with mixes of different policy instruments that can best address the policy objectives. So this we call the 3 steps to mainstreaming. But it's clearly very, very important as well that we look at integrating biodiversity across different policy sectors. So biodiversity policy shouldn't just be about biodiversity strategies and conservation policy directly, although that's very important. It's also about integrating biodiversity concerns in agriculture policy, in fisheries policy, in manufacturing policy, in services policy, for example. And it's clearly also important that we are very strong on participation so that we can integrate the wide range of values and different forms of knowledge, such as indigenous and local knowledge, within our strategies for the implementation of future policy. Clearly, continued conservation areas through well-managed protected areas are critically important, but that's not the only way we can arrest the decline of biodiversity. We clearly need some form of societal transformation through education, through changes in consumption patterns and preferences, and the acknowledgement that we all have a shared responsibility for addressing the problems of biodiversity loss. So this rather complex looking table provides a snapshot of where we are today in terms of the implementation of biodiversity relevant policy across a different range of policy sectors. So what we have across the top of this table are the different policy sectors: conservation, environment, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, etc. What we have in the first column are the 3 steps to mainstreaming that I introduced earlier: raising awareness, defining policy objectives, designing policy instruments and policy mixes. And the second column shows a whole range of different specific options and opportunities that we can implement within these different categorizations. So for example, within step 3, designing policy instruments, there's a whole range of legal and regulatory instruments, economic and financial instruments, social and information-based instruments, and rights-based approaches and customary norms, and various specific things that we could implement. What the colours in the table seek to demonstrate is where we are now in terms of the implementation of these different steps across these different policy sectors. So, for example, the very dark green cells here show that we are effectively implemented this form of action within this sub-region, within this policy sector. And as you can see from the diagram, there are actually very, very few individual dark green cells where we have effective action. The light green cells show areas where we have done some implementation of policy, but there's scope for improvement. There's still room for us to do better. Where the purple cells indicate that the policy implementation or the opportunities or actions are very underdeveloped or not even started. And the red cells show that there's no initiative whatsoever in that policy sector and for those options and policy instruments. So what the table shows is that as a whole, we're not doing particularly well at the moment in terms of what we're implementing through policy. However, the positive way of looking at this table is that we have enormous scope for action. There are many things we can do at the level of policy that will enable us to do much better in terms of conserving biodiversity and reducing the loss of nature's contributions to people. So that's the positive message we want to get across. There's plenty of scope both for governments but also individuals within society and the private sector to implement policy that can help us to conserve biodiversity. So in conclusion, we know that biodiversity, ecosystem services and nature's contributions to people are extremely valuable for human well-being. But we know that biodiversity in most of these services are in decline, despite a few positive examples of where we've managed to manage biodiversity in a better way. We also expect that these declines will continue into the future under a whole range of different future scenarios and pathways, but especially if we continue with business as usual. And finally, there are many opportunities for decision makers to mainstream biodiversity within a range of integrated sectoral policies through mixing of policy instruments and many multi-actor opportunities. So finally, as co-chairs, myself and Marcus would like to very strongly thank and acknowledge the immense hard work of all of the people who've contributed to the ECHA assessment. Both the individual authors who spent a considerable amount of time making contributions to individual chapters, but also the wonderful support of our technical support unit, as well as the IPBES Secretariat. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much, Mark and Marcus, for that great presentation and for taking the time to join us today. Before we end the webinar, I'd just like to remind all of you listening in that you can access the recording of this webinar, as well as a range of other resources on the IPBES website. And if you have any questions about the webinar series, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. That's all we had for today. Thank you again for watching, and we look forward to have you join us again.